Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here, and in this episode of Upcycling, I would love to share with you 7 tips that really helped me to take my upcycling game to the next level. And even more than that, they actually helped me to sort of change my perspective about this craft, because although it is a really great way how to save a little bit of money and repurpose and reuse what we already have, I also think it is one of the really creative ways how to fuel that creative spark that we have on the inside. And as always, I have prepared real life examples for you so that way you can see what I mean, experience that, and hopefully find a ton of inspiration. So without any further ado, let's dive in. Now, I did mention that some of these tips really did change my perspective about upcycling, so I guess that would be a good place where to start. And I feel that a lot of times, and it doesn't only pertain to upcycling, but a lot of things in life, we approach those things from the background that we come from, and that's perfectly natural. So my background is sewing, therefore I approach upcycling from the point of view of sewing. I see old clothes that I no longer wear, and therefore I use sewing in order to transform them. But in reality, there's so much more to upcycling than just the sewing side of it. I have some examples over here, and that's not even all of it. And I really want to encourage you to explore those options, because not only they can complement your sewing abilities, but sometimes it can be a better option. So for example, that happens a lot with white clothing and dark clothing. So whites are no longer white after some period of time, and I know that you can bleach it, but let's say you have some fabric that does not take any bleach and you get a stain or something. And then of course dark colors like black and dark blue eventually do fade out. And if everything else is still great with those garments and the only issue is the color, then you can bring that color back or completely change the color with just one simple packet of dye and a little bit of creativity. Here I used a simple but really fun technique of ice dyeing to turn this white linen into this sort of like an explosion of pinks and a little bit of blue. Yes, I did dye my linen here before I constructed the shirt, but obviously the same will apply if you go thrifting for a shirt or if you have a shirt that you want to update with a bit of a pop of color. Another thing that a lot of us do have available, but perhaps we don't necessarily see that as the means of upcycle, are iron-on patches, iron-on vinyl, and of course a lot of you do have these cutting machines that will cut your vinyl into anything that your heart desires. And I think most of the time we consider that as a way to personalize a garment. But if you only have a small stain or a small hole, or perhaps you just need to refresh a garment, this could be a really quick and easy and super creative way how to do that. I had this really old cardigan in my wardrobe, and in order to update that, what I did is cut little dots from my glitter iron-on and then fuse them on top of my garment, and also I changed the buttons, so it definitely added a little bit of flair, a little bit of sparkle, and I loved wearing it again during this past winter season. Now, of course, embroidery is another great way how to add a little bit of personality to your garments, to update them and hide those stains and hide those holes. You can do embroidery by hand, you can do embroidery on your sewing machine depending on what kind of sewing machine you have. I am not particularly good at embroidery. I try, but I'm not really good. But there's no shortage of beautiful, gorgeous ideas for inspiration on the internet about embroidery around the neckline and on the sleeves and all sorts of different ways. So there's definitely plenty to explore. And these are just 3 very simple, very easy ideas for upcycling in this enormous ocean of different techniques that you can try out besides just the sewing perspective. I'm going to give you some really practical tips here in a moment, but before that, I really wanted to talk about the mindset, because I think it really is such an important topic when it comes to upcycling. And if you do come from a sewing background, I think you can agree with me that sometimes we sew what we want and not necessarily what we're actually going to wear or need. And sometimes all those 3 align in one perfect garment, but I'm sure it has happened to you that you made something that you want, but you don't actually wear. I know that it has happened to me. So I think in upcycling, it really is that important to think about not only what that old garment or that bed sheet can become, but what it needs to become, because the whole act of upcycling is about taking something that is no longer used or needed and transforming it into something new and purposeful. To add one more quick point to this, I also had to take the social media influence sort of away from my upcycling brain, because I think a lot of times it is super exciting to transform this into something like, wow, something's absolutely unexpected. But I have to remind myself that the size and complexity of an upcycle does not determine how useful that upcycle is actually going to be in my personal life. So I always approach from the perspective of what I need this garment to become and how is it going to serve me in my life, and from there I take on the upcycle. Okay, I promised practical tips, so here we go. Using smaller seam allowances, smaller hem allowances, and exploring new or alternative sewing techniques to what you used to can help you maximize what you have to work with in your upcycles. So in my case, I usually upcycle clothes that I wear. So a lot of times it doesn't really yield a lot of fabric. So I really have to squeeze out the most out of what I have. This right over here is actually a really great hands-on example how those two things that I just mentioned really helped me to complete this upcycle and complete it in the way that I like it. So the top was overalls for my daughter that were way too small, and the bottom was made from a button-up shirt that was mine, so not a lot of fabric to work with. And in order to be able to gather that skirt the way I wanted in order to attach it to the top of the overalls, I used really tiny seam allowances, and this has been washed many times. I know sometimes people say, how do smaller seam allowances hold up? If you complete them in a really neat way and secure all of the raw edges of the fabric, they hold up just as fine. And in order to be able to create that gathered skirt, I had to use smaller seam allowances. And sometimes people think, well, what's 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch there? But if you have 2, 3, 4 seams, it does add up gradually. And the same thing happened on the bottom. So I had to cut the ruffle. Well, I couldn't cut the ruffle as long as I needed. So in order to preserve as much length of the ruffle that I could, instead of doing a single fold hem or double fold hem, I actually did a rolled hem on a serger, which required the least amount of fabric to be eaten up by that hem. So don't be afraid to try new finishing techniques and perhaps new seam allowances when it comes to upcycling, because it might just yield better results in that particular situation. Next tip is about learning how to hide and camouflage certain things during your upcycles. And I know it sounds a little bit sneaky, but I actually think it's a really useful skill when it comes to repurposing certain things. Because as you know, when we're doing upcycles, we're just working with what we have, which is usually not a lot. And sometimes that might lead to really awkward placement of the seams, or certain elements being in the places where we don't want them to be. Or let's say you want to cut a pattern piece, but you don't have enough fabric for that one pattern piece, therefore you have to combine different pieces of fabric together, and all of that can lead to a garment that just doesn't really look cohesive or just has things out of place. And in order to sort of remedy that, you can do a couple of things. So for example, in these shorts that were made from 2 button-up shirts, the front pattern pieces are actually made from 2 pieces of fabric, but you can barely see that unless you come really close, because I've used the pattern of the fabric itself in order to hide that seam. Same goes for the center back seam on this little jacket and for the entire back yoke on this linen shirt that was constructed from 7 different pieces of fabric. As you can see, doing your best that you can in the pattern matching job can really help those seams almost disappear. So these next 3 tips sort of like feed off of each other. So the first one is, if you want to use your old clothes in order to create new clothes, so to completely reimagine them, or let's say you really like thrifting old bed sheets or vintage fabrics and things like that, then having a basic set of patterns really helps with that task, because then you can learn how to navigate those patterns, how to rearrange them, how to adjust the seams and the fit and all those things in order to create something unique every time. Now I use bodice blocks and and pencil skirt blocks and pant blocks, but you don't have to do that. You just have to have a set of your favorite patterns that you know that fit you the best, so that way when you are doing your upcycles, you are 100% sure of the outcome and you don't have to second guess the fit of the garment while you're working on it. Now, if you don't want to create new garments completely, but you just want to adjust the old garments so that way they fit you better, if you do so and if you have a set of favorite patterns, those favorite patterns can help you understand the fit and can help you understand which adjustments to make on your old clothes in order to fix them and fit you better. And the third part is, of course, that you can use your old clothes or the clothes that you're thrifted in order to create those sewing patterns that you can use in the future. So for example, let's say you have your favorite t-shirt that is no longer good to wear, but you want to use it for some sort of project and you have to cut it apart at the seams. Now, while you're cutting it apart at the seams and before you proceed to your actual project, go ahead and copy the pattern so that way you have it for the future. You know the fit, you know that you like it, so next time you have something that you would like to turn into a t-shirt, you already have the pattern that you can use. As you know, I have videos on that on the channel about how to copy your existing garments and turn them into patterns. So if you've been wondering about how to do that, I will leave the link for you guys in the description. This next one is sort of like a tip, but also a big reminder for myself personally to be okay with using some of the tools that I don't usually use for my sewing. And that includes permanent fabric glue, fray check, hem adhesive. I also find that I use a lot more hand sewing in my upcycles than I do in my actual sewing. And I have to remind myself to be okay with that, because in the upcycling process, a lot of times what happens is we can't really get to that one tiny little corner without undoing the whole seam. And if we undo the whole seam, then it might damage the fabric. So you have to weigh pros and cons of what you're doing. And sometimes using these little things like that you don't usually use in your actual sewing might help the process. So my rule of thumb is if it gives you a good result and if it looks good, then why not? So here's season 1 of my upcycling series where we upcycle sweaters, dresses, shirts, and more. There you can find more inspiration and ideas for your own upcycles. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope this was useful, and until next time, happy, thoughtful sewing. Bye!